February 9th, 1864, led by Colonel Thomas E. Rose, 109 Union officers tunnel out of Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. 59 of the men will eventually reach Union lines. 59 of the men reached. It was 109. That means 50 people did not reach Union lines. Were they captured? Killed? What happened to the other 50 men? February 9th, 1864, led by Colonel Thomas E. Rose, 109 Union officers tunnel out of Libby Prison, Richmond, Virginia. That's the heart of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. They're going to flee Richmond, Virginia in a year from now, but in 1864, yeah, shit, Libby Prison, and that used to be an old tobacco warehouse. I got a narrative here. Just make sure I got the introduction. 109 Union officer, Richmond, 950. Okay, so let's just get into it. The Great Libby Prison Breakout, history.net.com. Colonel Rose got to Libby the day after the other Chickamauga prisoners arriving in Richmond in a passenger car rather than crammed into a filthy boxcar. The delay occurred because Colonel Rose had managed to escape from the POW train when it halted at Weldon, North Carolina, and spent the day wandering in the woods before being recaptured. He blamed an injured foot on his inability to evade the rebels. He blamed an injured foot will keep you from being able to run faster than... I was still very lame from the effects of a broken foot, not just injured. Oh, I got an injury. It's broken. The bones are broken from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where his regiment had overwintered. Even as Colonel Rose was settling into Libby life, even as Colonel Thomas E. Rose was settling into the Libby prison life, Tom Rose, Mr. Rose, began making note of the daily routine followed by prison guards and officers. There were just 25 in total. I thought that the whole party could be captured without alarm, he wrote, and for this purpose organized a society among the prisoners called the Council of Five. So we got 25 guards and officers. The plan, admittedly grandiose, was to overpower the guards, release men from other Richmond prisons. A total of nearly 16,000 Union officers and men were then being held in the city, arm them by storming the arsenals, capture President Jefferson Davis if possible, march south to the federal lines near Williamsburg. The council grew like Topsy, reaching 420 men, a third of the prison's population, within a couple of weeks. Keeping it secret proved impossible. The Confederates got wind of the operation and immediately tightened security, quashing his plan. Undaunted, Mr. Rose carried on independently. While he was exploring the prison's basement, he stumbled upon Captain Andrew Hamilton of the 12th Kentucky Cavalry, who was also seeking a way out. Together, they next turned their attention to Libby's carpenter's shop. The plan was to stand by the door on the inside of the shop, and when the sentinel had just passed, to slip out while his back was in that direction and walk off, Rose said. He tried it only to have the guard at the other end of the building spot him and call out, running back into the shop, which was as dark as Erebus, E-R-E-B-U-S, Erebus. Rose then climbed a rope up to the first floor in safety. A few days later, he tried again, but this time he was discovered by one of the workmen. I seized a broad axe with the intention of braining him if he attempted to call the guard, but he begged me not to come in there again. My next plan was to escape from the room under the hospital. Mr. Rose remembered to do so. Mr. Rose and Hamilton had to cut a vertical passage in the wall between the cooking room where the prisoners prepared and ate their meals in the hospital. They soon discovered the perfect site, a fireplace behind one of the stoves. Using tools stolen from the carpenter's shop, they began removing bricks. Rose recalled, we were obliged to make no noise, for one of the sentinels was just outside within 10 feet of where we were. Damn. It's like Guy Fawkes. Over the course of several nights, the pair completed a small opening in the wall. Was it large enough for a man to squeeze through? Rose decided to find out. Only 100 feet, George Washington from the front lines of the British at the Battle of Princeton. Right before they were at the Battle of Assunpink Creek. 100 feet away. The American Revolution was barely won. Barely. Rose decided to find out as soon as my feet and legs were dangling below. The inevitable law of gravitation forced my body into the hole as tight as a wedge. I was perfectly helpless. Hamilton, try as he might, was unable to budge him. I feared that the whole Southern Confederacy could not loosen me, Rose recalled. The captain ran upstairs to rouse a friend, and the two men managed to extricate him with one strenuous wrench. We all three fell upon the floor with a prodigious noise, wrote Rose. The sentinel seemed startled and confused. The ruckus even woke up the prisoners on the floor above, and the noisemakers held their breath for what seemed like an eternity, expecting their jailers to burst through the door any second, bayonets at the ready. To their great relief, no one came. To prevent a repeat, Mr. Rose made the hole larger. Once they had access to the basement room below the prison hospital, Mr. Rose decided to dig under the foundation to reach a sewer that led to the James River Canal behind Libby. Well, this is just like the one movie with the one guy, that one actor, and the Robbins, and Shawshank Redemption. Led to the James River Canal behind Libby. He organized a working party of 14 men whom he swore to absolute secrecy. Each night, some of the diggers lowered themselves through the hole in the cooking room to go to work. The indescribably bad odor and impure atmosphere of the cellar made some of them sick, wrote Mr. Rose. The uncomfortable positions in which they had to work amid crawling rats. The cellar was called Rat Hell. It was unendurable to some. Nevertheless, they cut out part of the foundation stonework, only to find that the building rested on wooden piles. To cut through these was a tremendous undertaking, but we toiled at it night after night until we got through. Once they started tunneling through the soil, however, they were inundated by streams of water, putting a halt to that endeavor. The prospect of escape now seemed so dim that all the diggers except Rose and Hamilton gave up. We too then tried another plan, Rose recalled, to dig through the prison waste sewer. The work went well, though it was ferociously odorous, until part of the sewer caved in outside. The Pennsylvanian wrote, we heard the rattling of the bricks and the call of the sentinel for the corporal of the guard. Lucky for the Yankees, the prison officers thought the collapse was due to the many rats that called Libby home, but it put a halt to that tunnel. These fruitless endeavors had consumed 2 months, and Hamilton was by that time on the verge of giving up, but Mr. Rose still had metal aplenty. I did not despair, but resolved to organize another party and dig straight through from the northeast corner to a yard enclosed by a high board fence directly across the street. The group of diggers he formed this time included men from the earlier effort. None of them seemed to have much hope, Rose later wrote, but several said they would work for no other purpose than to pass away the time. And thus on January 23rd, 1864, Thomas Rose and his crew set to work cutting a hole directly through the foundation. The 2 men assigned to getting through the stone wall, Major Beaton McDonald of the 101st Ohio and Captain Terrence Clark of the 79th Illinois, managed to accomplish their task in one day. January 29th, thought it was February 9th, so you only got 2 more weeks. Now came the actual digging. The soil was compacted sand, nearly as hard as a rock, Mr. Rose said. We made very rapid progress until we had proceeded about 15 feet when the air became so vitiated as to support life but a very short time. To provide fresh air, they used a wooden panel as a fan worked by one of the men just outside the tunnel. To remove the dirt, they used a wooden spittoon tied to a loop of clothesline, then spread the soil evenly around the floor of Rat Hell. Things went speedily until an event occurred which effectually put a stop to our work in the daytime, as Rose recorded, and greatly embarrassed all our operations. That event was a special roll call conducted by the commandant of the prison, Major Thomas Turner. Normally the prisoners were counted daily, standing in 4 ranks. Then Ross, the clerk, would pass down the front rank and count the files. The flies in the files. As long as they pursued this method, we had no difficulty in accounting for absentees who might be working on the tunnel. As soon as a man had been counted by the clerk, all he had to do was stoop and run quickly to the left of the line before Ross got there and be counted a second time. Other prisoners used to see us dodging around and thought we were doing it for fun. Devilment. They called it devilment. And they got to doing the same thing for devilment. Sure enough, this threw Ross's totals off for a number of days running, catching Turner's attention. That's when he called the special roll call. All the inmates were placed in one room and counted as they passed through the door. There was no chance for devilment this time. During the roll call, two of Mr. Rose's men were digging in the cellar. Captain Isaac N. Johnston of the 6th Kentucky Infantry and Major McDonald came the call. I.N. Johnston. No response. I.N. Johnston. Still no response. Twice more. I.N. Johnston. A notation was made on the rolls. And the count continued until McDonald's name was called. Rose wrote, "This affair caused me considerable concern as it awakened not only a great curiosity among the prison officials, but also among the prisoners themselves what to do. There were only two plans for them to pursue. One was to face the music. The other was to remain concealed every day down below. McDonald chose to come up. Johnston opted to stay in rat hell. Fortunately, the disappearance of the Kentucky captain seemed to raise no alarms among the prison staff. Work on the tunnel shifted back to nights. A more startling event followed some days later. McDonald, who was serving as the digger, got it into his head that we had reached the desired point across the alley. Mr. Rose wrote, I tried to convince him of the absurdity of the notion. He calculated that they still had 10 feet to go before they were safely under the fenced enclosure. But McDonald insisted on striking at once towards the surface. I told him that I wanted it distinctly understood that they were not far enough, but he might go cautiously to the surface to let fresh air into the tunnel and to satisfy himself that the tunnel was not yet long enough. I then went upstairs and retired. A confident McDonald dug towards the surface. When he suddenly broke through, he nearly panicked when he heard the guards, who seemed to be right on top of him. The young officer raced back upstairs to tell Rose. McDonald came to me in great consternation and told me the whole thing was discovered. Mr. Rose wrote, he said he had come right to the feet of the sentinel. We went below, and I noticed that the tread of the sentinel did sound very loud. The orifice at the surface was a little larger than a rat hole. I took one of my working garments and shoved it into the hole. McDonald's breach was never discovered. At that point, Rose decided that he and Hamilton alone would finish the tunnel. Over 2 nights, the pair dug all the way through to the yard. Rose recalled, on the night of the 9th of February, 1864, my party assembled. As soon as it began to get dark, I started out immediately, followed by Hamilton. We then went together down to the gate, and as soon as the sentinel's back was turned, slipped out, walked down the street along the canal to the first corner, then went north. When they came to a hospital guarded by rebel soldiers, the two separated. I did not see him again for several months, Rose wrote. Now on his own, Rose headed due east along the tracks of the York River Railroad. As it happened, he was attempting to make his way across country amid one of the coldest winters in memory. A slow, cold march of 11 miles brought him to the Chickahominy River, where he turned south, soon stumbling upon a camp of rebel cavalry. It was just daylight, and they were sounding Reveille, R-E-V-E-I-L-L-E, Reveille. He recalled, I found a large sycamore tree that was hollow. I concealed myself in this until the late afternoon, first making sure nobody was around. Rose then waded across the Chickahominy. It was pretty deep, and I got my clothes thoroughly soaked. Heading southeast, he came across another group of enemy cavalry. Rose lay upon the ground, waiting until dark to move on, but when I attempted to rise, he wrote, I found myself perfectly stiff and my clothes completely frozen. I was in great danger of freezing to death. The next night, Rose risked making a fire to warm himself. I was soon in a profound sleep. When I awoke, I found that I had been nearly in as much danger of burning to death as I was of freezing. My coat was burned through in several places, as well as my pants. He pressed on, reaching the New Kent courthouse that evening. Mr. Rose would have been astonished to learn that a total of 108 of his fellow inmates had crawled through his tunnel on the night of the 9th. Nor did he know, though he must have suspected from all the rebel activity he saw around him, that the Confederates had thrown a huge dragnet around Richmond and down the peninsula in an effort to recapture the fleeing Yankees. In response, the Union sent out the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry to pick up any escapees they could find, but all Tom Rose knew at that point was that he was cold and hungry and only halfway to reaching safety. Just outside New Kent, he had his first face-to-face encounter with the rebel picket. The man rode up to me, Rose said. He was a stupid fellow and asked me if I belonged to the new Kent cavalry. I had on a gray cap. Of course, I answered in the affirmative. He turned and rode back. Mr. Rose jumped into a nearby thicket of laurel as fast as my lame foot would permit, but now he had been spotted, and a group of cavalry was soon in full pursuit. Coming out the other side of the woods, the Yankee found himself facing a half-mile of open field with a small gully running across it. This was neither wide nor deep, but it afforded my only chance of escape. I threw myself into it and crawled the entire distance without raising my head. When I reached the end of the gully, I found myself at the Williamsburg Road, limping into a patch of pines. Rose hid for several hours before cautiously moving on. He spent much of the following day darting in and out of the woods that lined the road to freedom. Sometime that morning, Rose came to an open space. Here, to my joy, I saw a body of United States troops moving on the road to my left. I sat down and awaited their approach. The colonel remained wary. Hearing a noise behind him, he turned to see a trio of Union pickets. Their sudden appearance excited a suspicion that all was not right. After a few minutes, the sentinels began to walk toward the mass of troops further down the road. Rose took this to be a good sign, following them from a distance. When they spotted the bedraggled man, they called him over. As soon as I came close to them, I saw that I was entrapped. I endeavored to make them believe I was a rebel soldier, for he now realized these men were not Yankees, but Confederates dressed in federal uniforms. My first impulse was to break and run, but my lameness and enfeebled condition prevented me from doing this. Mr. Rose was once again in the hands of his enemy. One of the rebels began to lead him off across the field. I started off with him, limping fearfully. When they were halfway across, Mr. Rose sprang suddenly upon him, disarmed and prostrated him, fired off his piece, and started to run towards the troops, and would easily have escaped had it not been for my lameness. What's prostrated him? Prostrated. You have the prostrate. He took his prostrate out. Erebus is also spelled Erebus in Greek religion, the god of a dark region, of the underworld, and the personification of darkness. All right, so Erebus, super dark. He's the son of Chaos, who is also the mother of Erebus's wife, Nyx, the personification of night. Erebus is one of the primordial beings in the Greek creation myth. Wow, Erebus is like God. Prostrate, lying stretched out on the ground with one's face downward. Okay. And prostrated him, so face down on the ground. Took his gun, put him face down on the ground, then fired one shot. Fired off his piece, so just shot whatever bullet he had, or whatever was loaded. Soon Confederates were popping up from hiding places to pursue the prisoner. Two ran him down, berating him with their muskets, then carried him to a ravine a few hundred yards distant, away from the Union troops marching over the next rise. The man I had disarmed seemed to be badly hurt. Mr. Rose wrote, he wanted to kill me at once. An officer intervened, though he instructed the guards to by no means let me escape or be taken from them alive. A local farmer was enlisted to guide the rebels around the Yankee troops, who were, the man told them, thick as hornets on the other road. Mr. Rose was returned to Libby prison that frigid February and thrown into the dungeon for 10 days. Released from the cell at the beginning of March, he returned to his quarters upstairs. Mr. Rose had entered the prison 5 months earlier, determined to escape, and the evidence suggests he thought of nothing else during his incarceration. That he made no further efforts after his recapture may have had to do with a series of special exchanges that began early that spring. This took out most of the officers of higher rank, he recalled, and soon I was the only colonel left in the prison. But finally, on April 30th, 1864, Mr. Rose himself was exchanged. After a short stay at a military hospital in Annapolis, Maryland, he returned home to Pittsburgh and was reunited with his wife and children. He rejoined the 77th Pennsylvania as its colonel in early June. Today, the only reminder in Richmond that the Bastille of the Confederacy ever existed is a simple plaque mounted to the city's flood wall along the James Canal. It reads, on this site stood Libby Prison, CSA, 1861 to 1865, federal prisoners of war. What happened to Libby Prison? They fucking busted up and sent it to Chicago or something? What the hell? Used to have this big old, and it was a tobacco warehouse. You know, ship it on a train? What were you going to do with the Bastille of the Confederacy? We just put it on a truck. We put the Bastille of the Confederacy on a truck and sent it down the river. on down to Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Tennessee, Alaska, Hawaii, Alaska, Idaho, Alaska, Idaho, Alaska, Idaho,